And we're back on a Friday morning in the car, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday morning here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So, as a lifelong Yankees diehard, I have been saying since the team went off the cliff, Volpe sucks, Devin Williams sucks, Judge sucks. Well, maybe not Judge sucks, but Judge should be doing better. He's only hitting 320. He should hit 400. Stanton can't play. We've heard it all since they went off the cliff sometime in June. We got to clean house. Cashman's got to go. Hal's got to sell the team. Boone's, forget that. I mean, he should have been fired the first year that he was here. All of this from fans who have watched baseball, who have followed the team, and they have very short memories, unlike me, who has a very long memory. So I've been saying all along, they're going to turn it around. They made the trades near the deadline. This is a better roster than the team started the season with. It's not even close. The relievers are better. The position players are better. And at a certain point in time, fans need to stop complaining about Volpe. He's not going anywhere because he isn't making any money and he's on team control or under team control for at least the next 2 seasons. He's not going anywhere. He's not getting benched permanently. The guy could hit 180 if he fields his position, which he's had his problems, but we know he can field. He hits home runs. He produces runs. He's not going anywhere. And I wish that people would just stop. Yeah, complain about him. He sucks. I understand that. But they're not going to get rid of him because he hits home runs. And A-Rod even said, well, he might hit 160. That's still okay. If he hits 25 to 35 home runs, we take it. Because according to the metrics, he's still a more useful player, assuming that he is at least a reasonable defensive shortstop. So they're 10-3 in their last 13. And all of a sudden, there are sunny skies at the, in Yankee land, where a couple of weeks ago, everyone is jumping ship and giving up the ghost. Now, that leads me into what I really want to talk about. So 30 years ago this morning, on August 29, 1995, and I did a social media post yesterday, but it's an arguable whether I should do this, have done this episode yesterday or today. But at the close of baseball business on August 28, 1995, the New York Yankees, in a strike-shortened season, were 54-59. 54-59 with only 31 games remaining. They were buried. They were 16 games behind the Boston Red Sox for the American League East. And 1995 is a very important year historically for a lot of reasons, some specific to the Yankees, but some just from a general sense. It was the first year of the wild card. And without a wild card, the Yankee season would have been over, sometime in July when they started to sputter. But because there was a wild card, even though there were only 31 games left in the season, and there are 5 games under 500, I mean, we're talking about a second division club, theoretically. They were not out of play. They were still close enough because there wasn't anybody really running away with the wild card that year. You had about 10 teams within 6 or 7 games of the wild card. And it was only one. It's not the same structure now with more than one wild card and all that. And again, I'm not making judgment, just laying it out for you. But at 54-59, the Yanks had a disastrous road trip. But the roster was better than what they started the season with, because they had gotten Ruben Sierra, who was still in his prime. Prime Ruben Sierra, he looked like he was going to the Hall of Fame. He ended up just having a great career, but not really close to the Hall of Fame. And they had traded for David Cohn at the trade deadline. So they had the pieces to make a run, but they just played like shit, and they went on a West Coast swing and were pretty much battered by everybody to drop to 5 games under. They were coming home, though, and they had a 13-game homestand. And the idea was they have to do something on this homestand. They got to go at 10-3, or they have to do something and get back within like 2 or 3 games of the wild card lead. But there was nothing to indicate. So this Yankees team, they were in first place in 94. They basically ran away with the division, and then there was the strike. That was probably the primary motivator for Major League Baseball deciding to implement a wild card, because you had a lot of very angry fans. You spend all that money on season tickets, whatever it is, and then you have a 112 game season, and the season's over, and you don't get anything for your money other than a couple of memories of going to a game and a team that was running away and was a World Series contender. So the Yanks come out in 1995, and they started strong. The season began in late April because there was the issue with the strike. And here's my political moment of the day. A future Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor, who was in a Bronx District Court at the time, she figured out an injunction that literally forced Major League Baseball back onto the field. If that hadn't happened, I don't even know if we would have had a season in 1995. So if you hate the Yankees, you could say, well, fuck this. I wish that they had never started playing ever again. I wish we hadn't had baseball since 94. But they started play late in April, so it was only going to be a 144 game season. 1981 was a split season, a strike shortened season. I think there was 101 games or something like that total, but that's a whole other issue. That year's playoff structure, though, was similar to what we saw in 95 with what amounted to a division series, but that was because with the split season, one team may have been in first place in the first half and one team in the second half. But the 1995 Yankees came out of the gate firing, and the sense was they were just going to run away with the division again because the Blue Jays had kind of dropped off a little, and there was nothing to indicate that the Red Sox were going to suddenly return to prominence, despite the fact that they had Mo Vaughn in his absolute prime. And for the people under 40 who certainly know how great David Ortiz was, man, prime Mo Vaughn, he may not have had the clutch credentials of Ortiz, but Mo Vaughn was a monster hitter. You look at his prime numbers and you contrast them with Ortiz, there's really not that much difference between them. But the Yanks come out of the gate firing in 95. They were 7-2, and they weren't just winning during the first 9 games, they were dominating their opponents. They were winning easily. And after, we talk about you don't want to jinx things. Baseball is a very superstitious sport. Michael Kay, the very young Michael Kay, he was in his mid-30s at the time, on a post-game show, after the Yankees won their 7th of the first 9, he said, "This team has all the answers. They are better than last year's team." Now, me watching this at the beginning of May of 1995, I didn't have any reason to think that Michael Kay didn't know what he was talking about, because I sure as fuck, I said, this is a team they're gonna just cakewalk to the division here. This is fantastic. We haven't had a team this good since the mid 80s, is what I was saying. But alas, on their way to the 1995 World Series and parading down the Canyon of Heroes for the first time since 1978, the 95 Yankees hit something of a snag. And in their next 104 games, almost 2/3 of a season, they went 47-57. That's how they got to 54-59. Now, I don't need to explain to you just how incompetent that is, but that means for 2/3 of the season, they played like a 90-loss team. They weren't just so-so, they were horrifically bad. And that is how they arrived at 54-59. So they came home after this terrible West Coast trip with a 13-game homestand staring them in the face, and they were 54-58, and they had a makeup game against the Kansas City Royals. So it was supposed to be a 12-game homestand, but they did the makeup game on what was supposed to be the off day, and the Yankees lost another bad game. They had the bases loaded, 1 out, down a run, or first and third 1 out, in the bottom of the 9th, and Ruben Sierra hit a smash for a double play. And that's how they got to 54-59. It was all negative, and they woke up on August 29, 1995, 31 games to go, with the season apparently over. But I like to believe that there is a concept and something called the baseball gods. And I like to believe that the baseball gods, in Don Mattingly's last season, decided to shine a little bit of a light on the 1995 Yankees, who had not been to a postseason since 1981. And a concept that I brought up, but it's always worth repeating. There were no layers of playoffs until the wild card. It was you won your division or you're on the golf course the day after the season ends. And you go back to the 1980s, and if you check the records and you look at and you compare, well, what would, let's say, 1985 or 86 be under the current structure? The Don Mattingly era is tragic because Donnie he came up in 81, but he wasn't on the World Series roster. He pretty much just had a cup of coffee in 81 and 82 with the big club, didn't really have enough at-bats. And he was a rookie in 83. He was okay, but he wasn't ready for the big time. But if you look at the Yankees of 84, especially 85, a 97-win team, arguably the best non-playoff team in the history of baseball, 3 Hall of Famers in Dave Winfield, Ricky Henderson, and Phil Niekro, and 2 people who were very close to the Hall of Fame in Ron Guidry and Don Mattingly. The 20% legend roster, they missed the postseason. And then 86 and 87. The Yankees would have made at least 3 postseasons in the Don Mattingly era just through, 4, because they would have been in 93 also, and then you look at what they did in 94. It was just awful timing for Mattingly. So here they are, 14 years after their previous playoff appearance, which, it was an absolute disaster. The 1981 World Series, the Yankees won the first 2, and then the Dodgers just kicked the shit out of them, came back in all 4 games. We just blew one lead after another. George Frazier, no relation to Smoke and Joe, lost 3 games in the World Series. That is a record that's never going to be broken. No one's losing 4 games in a World Series. I'll go down on that hill. That is a baseball record hill that I am going to take my last breath on for 100% certain. No postseasons in 14 years. They got 31 games left, and they have 12 games on this homestand. They've got to do something. And something is exactly what they did. 2 games into the homestand, the Yankees were playing the Anaheim Angels, who were probably about 12 games ahead of them. It didn't seem to matter. The Angels appeared to be running away with the American League West. The number of games in front of the Yankees, the Angels were in late August, was irrelevant. But Paul O'Neill hit 3 home runs in his first 3 at-bats. And the Yankees won a game, and they won a couple more. And, it sounds so stupid, but the combination of teams in front of them for the wild card, like they had a number of nights during this homestand where they needed a certain combination of teams to lose so that they would gain a full game. And it appeared that every time they needed a certain combination, it happened. And Michael Kay, if you asked him this today, he will laugh, and John Sterling too, and they will say, this guy is exactly right. Because they talked about it on the air. And they talked about it after the season, after the regular season. So they started to win, and the teams in front of them continued to play 500 ball. And the last 12 games of this homestand, they went 10-2. So they had a 10-3 homestand, and everyone in front of them fell by the wayside. And they just began to play the kind of baseball that we saw not so much earlier in the year, but what we saw in the first half of 94 when they were threatening to just run away with the division and secure the American League East with like a double-digit, lead or whatever. So they won and won and won and won, and they just kept winning. And from what appeared to be a lost season, and all of the local sports writers, Mike Lupica, who I met, of course, in 2019, boy, what a great speaker he was. He's such an engaging guy. I know he can be contentious in print, but in person, he's a real prince. The guy was just great with fans and taking a few minutes to chat with us. Just terrific. I should say, that's what you hope when you meet somebody, especially if they, in print, he could be a bit of an asshole, but that's kind of his shtick. But Lupica, Marty Noble, Jack Curry, who works for the Yes Network, and a lot of the other sort of local reporters, they were just throwing dirt on the season and questioning the Yankee franchise as a whole, like, what are we doing here? And then 2 weeks later, Jack Curry, and you can Google these articles because all of the New York Times is digitized. Jack Curry is writing articles about, we never saw this coming, but the Yankees are 2 games out of the wild card, 1 game out of the wild card. Just kept winning. And with a week left in the season, the Yankees actually had nosed in front of Seattle. And a huge component here was that the Angels collapsed. A full-on collapse by the Angels, who were 12 games up on the Mariners and Yankees. That, again, the fact that they were up on the Yankees appeared to be irrelevant because they weren't really in competition. The Angels were going to win the division. But when the Angels started to stumble and stagger, the Yankees just lapped them because they won so many games. I think the Angels might have lost 16 out of 19. At the same time, the Yankees won, 17 out of 20. I'm not exact, but I'm close on this. It was just crazy what happened there. So the week left in the season, the Yankees had put themselves in position where they actually controlled their own destiny. And they lost one tough game. It was a home game where they had a late lead. And they did have Mariano Rivera in the bullpen, but Mariano, he was close to prime Mariano, but not quite. And he wasn't the closer. John Wetland was the closer. And Wetland, unfortunately, he didn't pitch as well in the second half. The first half, he was virtually unhittable, just striking everybody out and giving up very little in the way of solid contact. But the articles that Curry was writing, me as somebody who at the time, I was in my second year at New York University, the beginning of my second year at New York University Film School, the excitement level, because I vaguely remembered the 1981 postseason, but I had been a diehard fan for so many years. And this was my first experience with playoff type excitement and, the sort of atmosphere as a fan. And just thinking of the fact that if the Yanks make the playoffs here, they're going to host the first two games at the stadium no matter who they play. And I'm telling you, it was off the charts. I didn't know if they were going to make it, and you just had to play the games. But the articles written by people like Jack Curry and Mike Lupica, and Lupica's not a Yankees fan, whereas Curry was, but Lupica loved the history of the franchise, and he had certain people that he really liked on the Yankees. He didn't like Steinbrenner, but he liked Buck Showalter, and you got the sense he was pulling for the Yankees for a number of reasons, but for the historical imperative, he wanted to see another playoff game at the stadium. And there is something to be said for that. So, the Yankees, with a week left in the regular season, there was an idea that of their last 7 games, they needed to win at least 5. And then it was, well, maybe they need to win 6. Maybe they need to win all 7. The 1995 New York Yankees actually won out. They won out down the stretch. I don't think they lost a game in the final week. Sorry, I wanted to check my work and the facts to make sure that I'm not, giving you incorrect information. So the Yankees won 7 of 8 heading into the last 3 games of the regular season. Again, given that this was the first year of the wild card, there were actually a couple of components that Major League Baseball had not fully ironed out. There were runouts of the season where if they happened, they hadn't made a decision at the time, well, if this happens, then we're going to go with this, or there will be a playoff over here. There was just a bunch of stuff that I guess they hoped would not come to pass. So going into the last 3 games of the season, the Yankees would have been 22-6 in their previous 28 games, so just over 4 weeks of baseball. There were 2 playoff slots for 3 teams. The winner of the American League West obviously was in the postseason, but then the other 2 teams were battling for the wild card, and with 3 games left, any combination could have come to pass because the Yankees were sitting as the wild card, or they were a game in front of Anaheim, but as I said, completely collapsed. And the Mariners were a game in front of the Yankees going into the last 3 games of the season. The Yankees went to Toronto. The Blue Jays had won the World Series, the 2 previous World Series that had actually happened in 92 and 93, but they had somewhat fallen off. So the Yankees went to Toronto with the understanding, hey, if we sweep, we're in no matter what. If we win 2 out of 3, we're probably in. And if we lose 2 out of 3, the odds are we're screwed. Because if we lose 2 out of 3, it's very difficult to imagine that we're going to not end up behind Seattle, who had just been playing tremendous baseball. They played like a World Series winning team in the same kind of stretch as the Yankees. So before the first game in Toronto, the Yankees got some good news, but not the kind of good news that you would necessarily expect. The good news they received was that, owing to the idea that Major League Baseball had not figured all of these permutations out ahead of time, the announcement was made that if there was a 3-way tie between Anaheim, Seattle, and the Yankees were going to get the wild card. They weren't going to have to play any more games. In the event of a 3-way tie, Seattle and Anaheim would play for the American League West title, and the Yanks were in the playoffs. Now, I don't need to tell you, if that happened today, there would have been rioting in the streets, metaphorically speaking, because people were really pissed off 30 years ago in the pre-social media era. You understand what I'm saying? The Yankees were in the position to win the wild card. You have two division winners. You're telling me that the loser of the division game is out? Like, that's not fair. Objectively speaking, that's not fair. But that's what was going to happen. So then the hope was, we don't want a three-way tie. You assume that two teams will end up with the same record, but hopefully not all three, because it's going to be a shit show, and fans of the city that ends up either Seattle or Anaheim in this instance, they are going to be foaming at the mouth with rage, and they're not going to be wrong. So the Yankees get to Toronto, and Toronto had long since been eliminated. And I figured, we're playing so well, we're just going to beat the shit out of Toronto too, no problem. But what ended up happening in that Friday night game is the Yankees fell behind, and they just couldn't get anything going against a really terrific pitcher from the era, who I think was on both of Toronto's World Series winning teams, Juan Guzman. He handcuffed them through, I think, either 7 or 8. And the Yankees went to the ninth inning. They went to the ninth inning down 3-0. They started a rally, and they had a single for 2 runs, excuse me. So the Yankees are down 4-2. No, I'm sorry. They scored 3 runs, and they had a runner on first with 1 out. And left-handed pitcher for the Blue Jays, who was okay pitcher, but he wasn't really what you would call a closer, even though that's what he was doing in this moment. Tom Henke was on St. Louis. He was the longtime, phenomenal, near Hall of Fame closer for Toronto. I love Tom Henke. The Yankees, for years, couldn't even get base runners against that guy. Man, was he good. Throwing 100 miles an hour with movement. But the Yanks are down a run. There's a man on first and 1 out, and Tony Castillo, the left-handed pitcher, didn't throw that hard, was on the mound. Now, normally, the number 9 hitter, who was Pat Kelly, normally you're going to pinch hit for him. You need a big hit. Pat Kelly was like a 230 singles hitter. Pat Kelly had been part of the previous regime, the Stump Merrill Yankees, where Pat Kelly was a marginal prospect. I felt that they made out to be a bigger prospect than he was. He was a great fielding second baseman, but he just didn't hit enough. He didn't hit enough. As baseball started to shift, and there were positions which used to be defense-only positions, like shortstop, where you could have a 240 or 250 singles hitter who just was good at fielding his position. There was no time in baseball where a 240 singles hitter, even if he was a Gold Glove caliber second baseman, that's not a long-term solution at second base. But Pat Kelly normally would be getting pinch hit for, but the Yankees did not have anyone to pinch hit. And they weren't going to put up Darryl Strawberry, who was on the roster. They weren't going to put Strawberry up against a left-handed pitcher. So Pat Kelly had to hit for himself. And Pat Kelly hit a 2-run home run. And the Yankees ended up winning that game 5-4. That's one of the underrated, enormous turns in the history of the Yankee franchise. That is one of the biggest regular season home runs. It's certainly in the top 5, because they won that game. The Yanks brought in John Wetland, and Wetland slammed the door. I don't think the Jays even got a base runner. And the surprise, the Mariners lost and the Angels won. So going into game 2 of 3, the Yankees and Mariners now had the exact same record, and the Yankees were still a game ahead of Anaheim. Now, the permutations were the Yankees could actually lose the last 2 games and most likely would still get in. But if they won the Saturday game, then they were guaranteed a playoff berth, because they could do no worse than a 3-way tie. So the Yankees went out on Saturday behind another person who came up during the Stump Merrill years, Scott Kamenicki. In 1991, the Yankees called up 3 heralded prospects. The hope was that at least one of them was going to have a huge career with the Yankees. None of them did. Scott Kamenicki, Jeff Johnson, Wade Taylor. Wade Taylor only pitched the 1 year, 91. He had a big fastball, but he wasn't consistent, and he never made the major leagues after that. Jeff Johnson looked like Andy Pettitte for about 8 or 9 starts, and then he just started throwing batting practice. But Scott Kamenicki was a survivor. And here he was in the biggest game of 1995, and he went out there and he threw a complete game. The Yankees won 6-1 on the Saturday, and I could still see Cammy's celebrating in his glove at the end of the complete game. The Yankees won that game. The Mariners lost. And the Angels won. But now the Yankees were for sure in, and there was a lot of debate on WFAN and ESPN radio. This is bullshit. Let's just hope there's no three-way tie. This was all being argued. But when the Yankees won the Kamenicki game on Saturday, they were guaranteed a playoff berth because the worst at that point was a three-way tie. The Yankees now were a game clear of Seattle and a game clear of Anaheim. But Anaheim was a game down on Seattle. So the Yankees went out on the last day of the 1995 season. You just want to win to make sure that there is no controversy going forward. And the Yankees won, and Don Mattingly, who was in his final season, hit a home run. They were going to win the game. So the Yanks went into the last game. They won it going away. Steve Howe, who hadn't pitched that well, got the final outs. And when the third out in the ninth inning was made, giving the Yankees of 1995 a final record of 79-65. Don Mattingly knelt down to one knee and just tapped his fist off the ground. And it's pathetic to think that this makes me emotional thinking about it almost 30 years later. But even me at age 21, I got it. This was a big deal to Don. And all the Yankees, and sometimes it's a cliche that we did this for this guy, we did it for that guy, but they all said, this was for Don. And there's an incredible moment from a historical perspective while the Yankees are celebrating on the field. There's a moment where you see Derek Jeter, who was he was on the 40-man roster, he didn't play that day, and Mariano Rivera and Don Mattingly in the frame at the same time. And it is really almost a changing of the guard, a passing of the torch, one captain to another. Don Mattingly, and Derek Jeter was the next New York Yankees captain. And who knew what Derek Jeter or Mariano Rivera would become on that incredible day in Toronto. But another reason why I love Buck Showalter as a Yankee manager. When the team was celebrating making the wild card, and it was kind of a strange celebration because nobody knew were you supposed to really get excited because it didn't feel like winning a division. But you had the same shot in the postseason. This was not like today, no home games or any of this kind of shit. And the Yanks were going to host the first two games at home. So you have a chance to get a leg up in the series in a best out of 5. You win the first two, the other team might not even get the three home games. But Buck Showalter sat in the dugout and let his players soak in the moment. Bernie Williams, Cone, Wade Boggs, a lot of guys who would become critical, John Wetland, in the 1996 run. It turned out that Seattle lost, and Anaheim won. So they were going to have a play-in game the following day. So the Yankees ended the season 79-65, and Seattle and Anaheim ended the season 78-66. So not only was there no three-way tie, the Yankees were clear. They had come back from 6.5 games out of the wild card with 31 left in the season, and about 7 teams in front of them. They lapped the field. They got them all. They beat every single team. So the sense now was where the Yanks have a great chance in the division series, regardless of who they play, because both teams are going to have to use their best pitcher in the play-in game. And that meant that Randy Johnson, who was right in the middle of his prime, this is peak Randy Johnson, 1995. Even if the Mariners won, which people expected they would, versus I think it was Chuck Finley or Mark Langston. I think it was Chuck Finley, who was terrific, a near Hall of Fame pitcher himself. But the idea was the Mariners are going to win, but the Yankees are going to be facing a couple of ordinary pitchers, Chris Bosio, Andy Benes. They were going to be facing guys that you could hit. Not that they weren't good, but they weren't Randy Johnson. That off day, the calm before the storm, the Yankees preparing for game 1 of the division series, that was as excited as I had ever been for baseball, about baseball. Because I was 21 and I was now going to be able to fully enjoy, didn't have to worry about bedtimes or anything like that as I had as a much younger person. So history tells us that the Yankees fell short, but they won both games in New York against that very rugged and tough Mariners team that didn't really have great pitching aside from Randy. The bullpen was not good. But they were a good team. They had multiple Hall of Famers on the roster, including, of course, Ken Griffey Jr., who was, for my money, prime Griffey, was better than Barry Bonds when he was, the original iteration of Barry Bonds, not 73 home run Barry Bonds, but the human Mickey Mantle statistics Barry Bonds of the 90s, or the 80s and 90s. The Yankees won both games in the Bronx. And both Michael Kay and John Sterling, the broadcasters, had said in later years, the loudest they ever heard Yankee Stadium was during the 2 games of the 1995 Division Series. It was as if the fans were so excited that playoff baseball was back in the house that Ruth built. They were just cheering their heads off. And Don, in his last game as a player in pinstripes, game 2 of the 95 Division Series, for me, top 5 greatest games in the history of baseball. Don hit a tie-breaking homer in the 6th inning, which you'd like to say was the game winner, but it wasn't. But he hit a tie-breaking homer in the 6th inning, and the fans went so berserk, they had to actually stop the game. After the incredible high of winning both games in the Bronx, the Yankees went to Seattle, and they lost going away in Game 3, but they blew leads in both Games 4 and, unfortunately, Game 5, where they pushed a run across against Randy Johnson in extra innings, but gave up 2 in the bottom half. And the season of 1995 and the career of Don Mattingly came to an end. But 1995 ultimately, and that unbelievable stretch run of going 25-6 in the last 31, and then winning the 2 incredibly exciting games at Yankee Stadium, it showed that this once great franchise was on its way to being the Yankees again. And wouldn't you know it, they won 4 World Series in the next 5 years. Probably the last true dynasty that we will ever see in Major League Baseball because of all the extra layers of playoffs. But on this day, 1995, the rebirth of the New York Yankees began with a huge homestand. This has been episode 600, wow, of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Friday morning here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.